All right, welcome back to History and Politics Chat. And I wasn't entirely sure that this would go on because I said initially I would do it 8 times, and we are in the 9th week, but you guys seem to like it, so we'll keep on going. And I have a good time looking up the answers to a lot of your questions because I don't just wake up every morning and know, for example, the history of the WHO, but I get a chance to look at it. So let me get right down to your questions today. And what they do is they kind of bring us full circle the way I've organized them, and I hope you will find them useful the way I've gone ahead and organized them. So let me start here. I'm going to try and keep an eye on did I just lose the entire feed? Hang on a second, folks. I'm not entirely sure I'm still broadcasting because it looks to me like I've lost the feed. No, it says I'm still live. All right, so let me go ahead here and start with a question from Charissa Lynch Uzzi, which is going to start us off, and I hope to bring us fully around by the end of today to the other side of this question. So let's start with this question. She says that she would like to know the answer to why every time that there are discussions about democratic policy is she met with, well, that's socialism, and that's bad for our country, and that ends the discussion. Even as she says, when people in Tennessee were pushing for the expansion of Medicaid, it was the same rhetoric. So how did we get to this point in America where any kind of government activism that really seems to be for the good of everyone is dismissed as socialism? And I had to start here because, like, this is my happy place. This is the late 19th century, and all of the patterns that we are living today get established in the 19th century around these questions of socialism. So let me start here, not actually in 1871, which is where I'll be going, but in the 1840s, when Americans are grappling for the first time really with the concept of what industrialization means. You know, you start this country with the idea that every man, because they're really talking about men in this period, but every man can sort of make it on his own, and he can be a farmer who's going to be able to support his family, and he's going to be able to work hard and pull material out of the ground and go ahead and be able to go ahead and support his family that way. And that sounds great, and it makes a lot of sense, except then you get the rise of industries, of bigger places where people are working hard and they're working for a daily wage, and you can't actually see the relationship between their work and the paychecks they get. And what is that going to mean? What does that relationship between labor and capital mean? And this is in the middle of the 19th century, and if you think about the 19th century, you think about the big picture of the 19th century, this is a central question that people across the Western world are grappling with. What does it mean to divorce an individual, a man, really they're talking about, to divorce a man from the work he's doing and the what he's producing? Like, what does that mean? Like, who gets the money? And does if you have more money and you employ other people, does that change the relationship? And a lot of people are grappling with this. Everybody from people like Abraham Lincoln, who's wondering about it, to people like Karl Marx, who's also wondering about the same things. He's obviously a philosopher and a historian that is going to be really important to the whole concept of capitalism and socialism as we understand it today. But so they're thinking about these questions. And one of the things that happens in the 1840s and the 1850s is some thinkers start to say, well, this is a problem. This whole idea that people are working and sort of accumulating capital and employing other people, this is corrosive to the human psyche and to the body politic and to humanity. And so what we really need to do is we need to create new forms of social interaction based in community, based in social norms. And this is an early form of socialism, as it was called, but it's obviously not the socialism we're going to be talking about in the 21st century, but it's important for America, and I'll explain why in a second. So they have these ideas of sort of this communal behavior, and you have people developing sort of communal living, places like the Oneida community in New York or Brook Farm in Massachusetts, and this idea that somehow you can get away with you can get away from the relationship between labor and capital by sort of having these new forms. And they're trying a lot of new ideas, and none of them are overwhelmingly successful. But this is a really big thing in the mid-19th century, this question of sort of societal reform. How do you create a perfect society, if you will? And a lot of people are looking at a lot of different ways to do that. You have people trying to screw around with diets so that people can purify their body through diet, which is how we get, for example, the Graham diet, which is supposed to help people get away from the sins of alcohol and from the being enslaved to certain eating patterns. And by the way, that's why we still have the Graham cracker that came from that diet. People are trying to get away from the sins of alcohol. We get the temperance movement. They're trying to get away from the sins of sexism, which is how we get the early women's movement. They're trying to get away from the sins of human enslavement. That's one of the ways we get the early abolition movement. But they're also trying to figure out this relationship between labor and capital. So they go ahead and they have these societies, and they're not terribly successful. Okay, so that's the background in the 1840s and the 1850s. But what happens then is that this idea, this American idea of what socialism is going to mean something very different in the 1870s, because you have sort of this communal idea. All right, so hang on to that thought for a minute, because I want to step back and talk about the real differences between socialism, communism, and capitalism today. Because when people use those words today, when scholars use those words today, they don't mean anything like what I just described. They don't mean people running around trying to figure out this new relationship in the 1840s. The way we understand them today is a reflection of 20th century history. And America's not going to really do either of these things, which is why I'm setting it up this way. So in the present, when people talk about socialism and communism, they're talking about systems under which the means of production are owned by the state. And now all of a sudden I can hear people going, wait, that's not what socialism is. Actually, the trick to socialism is a really slippery concept. But there's some major differences between socialism and communism. So in both of those isms, if you will, the state owns the means of production. But the state in each of those means of production is theoretically owned by the people. So theoretically, the people own the means of production in socialism and communism. But in socialism, that state generally is democratically elected, theoretically, so that socialism theoretically has a democratically elected government that then owns the means of production. And many of the states that we now see as socialist states are really not fully socialist states at all. They're democratic socialist states, and that I'll explain in a second if it seems important. It's really not for America in a lot of ways. Communism is a different kettle of fish altogether, because communism is a system under which the state owns the means of production, but the state has usually been put in place through means of a revolution. So it's not democratically elected. It is a part, as Karl Marx saw it, as a stage of human development. So communism becomes this stage of human development that eventually is going to create a new kind of social utopia that we actually never get to. So that's socialism and communism, in which the people theoretically own the means of production. Okay, so that's a key term, term to understand how America gets into this moment where we say that anything that works for the people is socialism. Okay, and standing against those is capitalism. And capitalism is itself a really, really interesting concept, theoretically. And I'm talking about these theoretically, of course, because capitalism basically relies on the idea that the market, the exchange of goods between individuals, solves everything. That basically you don't want a government to intervene in the relationship between individuals and their exchange of production, because there is a natural equilibrium to that system so long as you leave people alone to work within it. Of course, that's very different on the ground than it is when you start to have the rise of large industries in America in the late 19th century. Okay, so those are your three terms that go back to why in America we always look at anything that happens to help the people as socialism. So obviously, when I'm talking in the 1840s, they're not thinking about any government owning the means of production. That's just not on the horizon. Karl Marx is not really written yet. He's going to start writing in the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, but they're really not thinking about these large isms. They're just trying to figure out this relationship between individuals and labor, and now the rise of capitalists, of people who own a lot of stuff. So what happens is, going into the Civil War, there are two really important things that happen. I mean, there's a lot of important things that happen, but for this discussion, there are two important things that happen. And those two important things that happen are, first of all, that for the first time in American history, the Republican Party invents national taxation. So for the first time in American history, beginning in 1861, we have national taxes, including an income tax. Like, a lot of people make the mistake of thinking this is a democratic system that goes into place in 1913 with the Revenue Act of 1913. It is not. American taxation and income taxes go into effect in America in 1861. It's the Republican Party that invents them, and that itself is a really interesting story. So for the first time, we have national taxation, and then we also have something else that important, vitally important, that happens during the war, and that is that by 1865, the Republican Party has made manifest its belief that every individual man should have equal access to opportunity, and with that that concept, Lincoln, well, it's actually a little bit different. When Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863. But we get the 13th Amendment. We get the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which says, of course, that we will not have enslavement in America except as punishment for crime, which, of course, is going to be a loophole that people can drive a tractor through, if you will. But we get the outlawing of human enslavement, and then we get the increasing, and this is a little bit complicated, the way it actually played out on the ground, but for today's purposes, we get the increasing public voice of African American men, beginning in 1868 with the 14th Amendment, when the 14th Amendment overturns the Dred Scott decision of 1857 that says that African American men cannot be citizens. The 14th Amendment in 1868 says that's nuts, of course they're citizens. And then in 1870, we get the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which says that you cannot abridge the right to vote based on race or previous condition of servitude. With that, we get this really toxic combination in America. And that is that during the war, the Republican Party had very deliberately moved the support of the government away from sort of just backing the rich planters in the South, and in favor of individual, ordinary men trying to make it in America. So they had done a number of things that were actually remarkably popular during the war. They had passed the Homestead Act in 1862, which gave ordinary farmers Western land, by the way, indigenous land, that's a different story, but gave well, it's the same story, but it's a different angle on the same story, but gave land to individual farmers in 1862. It established also in that same year the Land Grant College Act, which established our state universities so that regular guys could go to college even if your dad couldn't afford to send you. They created the Department of Agriculture to make sure regular guys could get seeds, which previously you had to have your seeds handed down from your dad. They put in place the Pacific Railroad, and in '64 the Northern Pacific Railroad, to make sure that men could get out to the western lands and to the western mines. And they did all these things that were enormously popular. They created our first national money so that people could do business across state lines, and they linked that money not to bankers as it had been in the past, but rather to small, ordinary people. The legal tender, the greenbacks that were declared legal tender in 1862 were backed solely by the government's willingness to pay and willingness to fund them through taxation. So this is enormously popular after the war. And coming out of the war, it looks like the system has been established, that the American government is no longer going to answer to the very wealthy the way it did before the war. It's going to answer to every ordinary Americans. Well, so what happens is that coming out of the war, of course, this combination of African Americans having a new say in American society is anathema to Southern Democrats and Democrats across the nation, but really to Southern white Democrats who fought an entire war to make sure that African Americans would remain enslaved for eternity. So the idea of Black people actually having rights is, of course, what gives us the KKK and the Ku Klux Klan, which is a terrorist organization designed to prevent African Americans from taking their rightful place in American society. They're doing everything they can to sort of remand African Americans back to some form of slavery. So what they find out pretty quickly is it doesn't work. In the late 1860s, when the KKK is really taking off, and in the early 1870s, what Americans do is they elect Ulysses Grant, Ulysses S. Grant, who of course was in charge of the armies that destroyed the Confederacy. And he takes one look at what's happening in the South, and he gets put in place, first of all, the Justice Department. That's where we get this Justice Department, but also a series, Congress passes a series of laws that enables him to establish martial law in 9 South Carolina counties. And his people go in, under the Department of Justice, go in and they arrest the members of the KKK. They actually clean out about 2,000 members of the KKK and basically say, you can't treat African Americans this way. This is not okay. These were our allies during the war. They're the only people supporting the American government, and you guys are the ones who are in the wrong. So on the heels of that, Southern Democrats realize that they're not going to get very much traction if they keep complaining about African American participation in society based on their race. So they do something really interesting. They start to say, well, we don't mind that they're Black. That was never an issue, which is, of course, complete crap. They said that wasn't the issue. The issue is these are poor people, and they're voting after 1870 for leaders who are putting in place programs that favor them. They're voting for schools, and they're voting for hospitals. Big deal after the Civil War, of course. They're voting for roads. They're voting for improved infrastructure, and that's going to cost tax dollars. And who's going to pay those tax dollars? Well, the white people in the South are the only ones who have any money. So that taxation is going to fall on white people. And so what really you're looking at when you look at the participation of African American men in government is you're looking at a redistribution of wealth. You're looking at the redistribution of wealth from hardworking white people to African Americans who clearly don't want to work their way up. And this is their formulation, of course, not mine. And it was an incredibly effective formulation, because at the same time, it's in the 1870s, at the same time in the North, you have Northerners whose lives have really taken off after the Civil War because of all the investment in technology and industries and all that during the war. It's really taken off, and it's brought a lot of immigrants into northern cities. And a lot of people in the North are looking at the immigrants who are now coming not so much from the old regions like England and Germany and Ireland that they had become used to, but instead are starting to come from Southern and Eastern Europe. So you're getting Italians and Polish people and Slavs, and they're looking at that and they're saying, well, wait a minute, we're not really sure they're a very good idea either. And at the same time, you're getting organized labor movements across the North where people are saying, hey, wait a minute, we got left behind during the Civil War, and we would like the government to do some things to protect some basic rights of labor. So what happens is, beginning in 1871, really taking off from 1871 to 1874, you get this increasing argument in America that having poorer workers, people of color in the South, and immigrants largely who tended to vote Democratic in eastern cities, northern cities, that letting them participate in society was a form of socialism, because they would vote for politicians who would give them stuff. So they would look at, under this argument, you would look at, for example, the establishment of schools and say, wait a minute, that's taking tax dollars from, these people who've made it on their own and redistributing that wealth to poor people. Now, that's pretty much what the Republican Party had done during the Civil War, but in that case, it was defined as investing in society, and they quite literally said, we are investing in the future. When William Pitt Fessenden, who was from here in Maine, he was a senator from Maine, when he started talking about the establishment of the Department of Agriculture, during the war, there's no money, and here they are saying they need a Department of Agriculture, and a lot of Democrats are like, you guys are nuts. And William Pitt Fessenden said, there is no doubt that we will be repaid for this over and over and over. And he refers to it as seed money. Isn't that cool? Anyway, so during the war, they're doing this for this very reason. But after the war, you get this idea that poorer people participating in society is a form of socialism. All right, so they're using that word from the 1840s and the 1850s. But in 1871, we get something really important that happens, and that is that in Paris, from March through May of 1871, after the Franco-Prussian War, people in Paris feel like they've been sold out by their government in the peace treaties. So they go ahead and they organize the Paris Commune. And that Paris Commune is fascinating. I mean, I'm sure it's interesting if you're a French historian too. I know nothing about that. It's interesting from the American perspective because Americans had just put down in 1869 the Transatlantic Cable. And the Transatlantic Cable was hideously expensive because it kept breaking, among other stuff. I mean, it's actually a really interesting story, you know, how you encase a cable in that day and age. Anyway, so I'm not going to go into that because you're probably all bored, but I love this period. Anyway, they put this cable down in 69, and in order to pay for that, you need headline news. And of course, the Paris, the Franco-Prussian War had given them sort of salacious stories and bloody stories and stuff from the front. And then when that ends, they ain't got nothing except the Paris Commune. So the Paris Commune, the news about the Paris Commune comes across that transatlantic cable and is headline news in America for all the months it's in play. Not least because there's one foreign minister permitted to stay in Paris in that period, and that is Elihu Washburn, who was a major figure in the Republican Party at the time, and everybody thought he was going to be the next presidential nominee. So he actually sends dispatches out of Paris by balloon, and they end up coming across the across the transatlantic cable, and they come to America. And the whole point of this is when they come to America, Americans, the headlines scream that what is happening in Paris is what could happen in America if you let workers take over society. And that is, they have put together a commune, because they call themselves the communards or the communists. And mind you, this has nothing to do with 20th century communism, but they call themselves communards. Americans call them communists. And they argue that if you let these people control society, what's going to happen is they're going to take over government and use it to reallocate wealth. And that's what they believe is happening in Paris, that the communards are redistributing wealth from wealthy people to poor people. They're beheading priests, and their women are throwing bombs into the basements of buildings, filling bottles with petroleum and putting a rag in them and lighting them on fire and throwing them into the bottom of buildings, which shows they're just entirely destroying society. So by 1871, 1872, 1873, Americans are starting to associate voting on the part of the poor, you know, regular Americans, with the idea of socialism or communism. And in 1871, on the heels of the Paris Commune, we get two things. We get, first of all, the idea that the National Labor Union is going to have its annual meeting that fall. It doesn't, it gets put off. But for our purposes, in October of 1871, that's when Chicago burns. If you remember the story of Mrs. O'Leary and her cow and Chicago burning, that's because, or what people look at that as they say, this is the poor people. These are the immigrants trying to destroy our way of life. And actually, that's not at all what happened in Chicago. Chicago was built in very hastily, and it was all wood, and you know, it was a fire that just tore through Chicago. But the image of Mrs. O'Leary and her cow is very deliberately tying into the idea that immigrants are destroying American society. And, you know, she's a myth, Mrs. O'Leary and her cow. So anyway, when Americans, so then from that, Americans, whenever in the late 19th century, whenever ordinary Americans tried to organize and say, hey, wait a minute, we're tired of the government working for big business the way it does by the 1880s with its tariff walls, for example, that enable industrialists to collude to raise prices. Whenever they do that, the answer is simply, you guys are communists, you guys are socialists. And that plays very nicely into the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, when in fact you do have the establishment in Russia of a communist government or a socialist government. And when that happens, Americans sort of go on overdrive. in their fear of communism. So American international communism really bleeds into this old American fear of communism, but international communism, as I say, is not the same thing. Those are violent revolutions that are that establish a strong state, and in which theoretically the state controls the means of production. That's never been what communism or socialism was in America. It has simply drawn strength from that. And you can see that in the present when people talk about the idea that healthcare, for example, is socialism. What they're saying is that it's going to cost tax dollars, and that means it is at some level going to be a redistribution of wealth. Now, that's what society is. You know, when we put down roads, we use tax dollars to make things better for everybody. But it has this long history in America that you can maneuver pretty well to get people not to do things that are good for society. So this really got teeth after the war, and I won't go any more into this because I know you have other questions that you wanted to get to, but I find this stuff obviously endlessly fascinating. After World War II, when a certain faction of the Republican Party wanted to destroy the liberal consensus, wanted to destroy that government that regulated business and provided a basic social safety net and invested in infrastructure, they simply kept saying that's socialism, that's communism. And that's when you get the rise in the 1950s of what we call movement conservatives, people who said the government doing anything other than protecting big business is by definition socialism and communism. And that was really a very deliberate attempt on the part of movement conservatives to do that. I'm going to leave that there because I've already gone on far too long, and I like to keep these things short enough that you don't fall asleep in the middle of them. But obviously I will do more with this in the future if anybody is interested, because it's so important, and the stories are just fabulous, especially from the 1870s and the 1880s and the 1890s. All right, so that is why whenever anybody says let's do something for everyone, somebody screams no, that's socialism and communism. And you see that now obviously with the idea that you should wear a mask and we should be taking care of each other. The people screaming that this is communism infringing on their rights is straight from this history. It's on steroids right now because certain politicians have managed to rise to power on it, but that's the history behind it. All right. Carolyn Snowberg asked, or said, I know nothing about inspector generals. I knew nothing about them until Trump started firing them. What is the history of inspector generals? When were they created and by whom? Okay, this is a great question. And it speaks back to the idea that I was just talking about, because inspector generals are created in 1978. And if you think about the pattern here, that makes a lot of sense, because we don't really get a big enough government to really need a lot of oversight, with some caveats, until World War II. And with the establishment of this liberal consensus, with the idea that we should have a big government bureaucracy that regulates business and provides a basic social safety net and promotes infrastructure, then you get a big enough government that you need oversight of it. And in the past, oversight generally was done on the part of Congress. And so you get a few very important, really actually cool, very cool congressional committees, like the Peugeot Committee, for example, and the committees that oversees American finance. There are committees that oversee the munitions industry during World War I. But generally, it's Congress that oversees things. And actually, this is completely an aside because I'm on vacation, so you're going to have to deal with my asides. One of the things that's really fun for 19th century historians is that whenever Congress gets pissed off about something in the 19th century and people say, oh, someone's doing something, Congress creates a committee. And they create a special investigative committee. And that investigative committee goes off and it conducts interviews, a lot of interviews with a lot of people. And they produce a report containing all these interviews, and then they put it on a shelf and no one ever reads it. But so for historians, we can go back and we can actually see actual testimony from like Sitting Bull, because people would go out. Actually, at one point, Sitting Bull they go out and they ask Sitting Bull questions, and he actually accuses the guys interviewing him of being drunk, and they get into a big fight about whether or not it's appropriate to tell senators that they're behaving inappropriately. So anyway, you actually can read these interviews. So that's actually wonderful for 19th century historians. But in 1978, once we have this big bureaucratic government after World War II, it's only natural that you're going to have fraud and you're going to have problems with it. And so in 1978, as Jimmy Carter is trying to clean up some of the frauds that have been happening in American government, he actually establishes 12 inspectors general in the United States government to oversee programs to make sure that people are committing fraud and to try and weed out corruption. That number has increased since 1978 until we now have 73 inspectors general, and they oversee about 14,000 employees. And this actually is estimated to save billions of dollars for the US government. And I want to point out a few things about the patterns of corruption in government. Because people are people, there's going to be corruption in a government. But one of the things that's really cool about the establishment of inspectors general, and I'm going to tell you more about that in a second, is that they help to keep down fraud not simply by rooting it out, but also by being there. So if there's somebody guarding the hen house, if you will, the foxes are less likely to engage in nocturnal behavior. So having them just there and knowing that they could call you out actually helps to tamp down people misbehaving. It doesn't eliminate it, but it helps to tamp them down. So after Carter establishes it, Ronald Reagan then pulls them together in 1988 with an organization called the President's Council on Integrity and Efficiency. And in 2008, George W. Bush actually puts the inspectors general in charge of that themselves. He establishes the Council of Inspectors General on Integrity and Efficiency. And then there's a lot of changes under Barack Obama. Most importantly, he beefs the whole system up. He, in 2010, establishes an inspector general for the intelligence community. And that's how Donald Trump has gotten in trouble, obviously, is with the inspector general of the intelligence community. And then in 2012, under the President Obama's administration, we get the Whistleblower Protection Act, which is part of the inspectors general system. And the idea behind all of this is that, let me give you one more act. There's another act in 2016 that gives inspectors general more access to data and more access to the agency's information. So, there's a couple of pieces here. First of all, the inspectors general are supposed to report to Congress twice a year, every 6 months. And the reason, again, that we have them is sort of this idea that if somebody's watching, there will be less fraud. And you can ask them, I guess you could ask them too, but Congress certainly can say to them, hey, we're not cool with this, you'd better look into that. And as I say, with 14,000 employees, that's what they do, they look into things. They also report to the agency's head, which is probably how Linnick just got in trouble with the State Department, because he had to tell the State Department what he was doing. And he was recently not fired. I'm going to tell you more about that in a second. But I wanted to mention a little bit more about whistleblowers, because there's all this, there has been so much pushback in the Trump administration against whistleblowers, that they're somehow bad news. And the trick is, you really want to have whistleblower protections for a couple of reasons. First of all, theoretically, if you're the head of an organization, you want someone to be there calling out trouble before it becomes huge. You want somebody to say, hey, we got a problem over here, so that it doesn't fester until it becomes something really big. So you want those people to be willing to say, hey, my boss is on the take, or whatever, without getting in trouble for it, without there being retaliation for that. But think about what would happen if we didn't have whistleblower protections. So for example, you might get really frustrated in your job, and rather than going through the established system, and there is, as I say, this system now with whistleblowers where they have to go, first of all, to an ombudsperson who will, and they'll say, you know, I'm not happy with what was over here. I think there's a problem. And that person in turn has to say, oh yeah, this is a credible problem. Because there's a lot of stuff that isn't credible, right? But they have to say, yeah, this is credible, and it's something we got to do something about. So, so it's credible and it's urgent. So they need to be able to say it's credible and it's urgent, and that's what happened with the whistleblower over Ukraine, over the Ukraine scandal. Is he went to the person he was supposed to go to, and the person said, yeah, this is credible, and yes, it's urgent. And that's when it went forward, and the acting director of national intelligence refused to hand it over to Congress, which was against the whistleblower law. All right, so so if you don't have those protections, if you as an employee can't say, my boss is secretly selling secrets to whomever or whatever, I'm making this up obviously, what are your options? Your options are to go to the press, and that may be a course of last resort, but you don't really want your national secrets to start in the press. You want them to be able to be dealt with internally so that it doesn't hurt the credibility or expose national secrets that that might actually hurt the nation. And you've seen this, for example, and you know what, I'm actually not going to call out, there have been press leaks, and I was going to use one from another country that involved the death of a number of people, but I guess I'm not going to do that because I don't want to expose anybody else to any kind of danger. But you can imagine a whistleblower going to the press, and the press, certain press outlets using that information irresponsibly and leading to death, basically. Or I'm being dramatic, leading to, I don't know, something that you could have taken care of internally. You can use your imaginations on this. I think it's pretty clear. All right, so where else to go with this? So, so the whistleblowers can be removed by the president, but here's the trick to all this. The whistleblowers, if the president wants to get rid of a whistleblower, he or she has to give Congress 30 days notice. So that we you know, the news people keep saying that Lennox's been fired. Technically, he hasn't, nor was the guy before him, Michael Atkinson, because technically all Trump could do was say to Congress, I want to get rid of this guy. And in the case of Atkinson, he then put him on administrative leave. And immediately Congress said, hey, wait a minute, you're not allowed to do this. But of course it went nowhere. And Chuck Grassley, who's in charge of this, is not pushing it at all. But technically the president can only give notice to Congress, and Congress then has to come back and either ignore it and say, yeah, whatever. And that happened. That's happened before, where I think it was under the Obama administration, one of the inspectors general was problematic for a number of reasons, and they dismissed him, and it you know, there was a lawsuit. Well, whatever. It could happen where Congress looks at the dismissal of an inspector general and says, yeah, whatever, the guy's a lunatic, let's let him go. But in the cases of I think we might actually be up to 5. I know we're up to 4 inspectors general, but Trump has let go. Theoretically, Congress could, and in some cases has, stepped in and said, you can't get rid of this guy. He's investigating you. But so far, all of these things have stopped again and again and again because the Republicans in the Senate are not willing to stand up to the Trump administration. And this is really, really important. And that's where I'm going to end today in a minute. The fact that while everybody is focusing on Trump, President Trump, there is a backstop here, and that's Congress. And Congress, the Democrats in the House, are trying desperately to create a backstop, but the Republicans who control the Senate are again and again and again saying, we're good, he can do whatever he wants. And this is a problem. All right, let me get down to the next thing. Dave Pitt Sr. wants to know, what about Donald Trump threatening to pull funding from the World Health Organization over its handling of the coronavirus? How do I think the WHO is handling the pandemic, and should the U.S. cut funding from the organization? Great question. And the WHO is fascinating. And I will talk about the present with the WHO, but just so you know, I got, I guess, kind of obsessed with the 1918 influenza pandemic a number of years ago. And my understanding of of the WHO, it has a lot to, it comes a lot from my understanding of influenza based on that. All right, so who is the WHO? The WHO is the World Health Organization, and the WHO is part of the UN. It's an agency within the UN, and its mission is that it is responsible for international public health. It was established in 1948, and it grew out of some earlier programs that really started in the 1850s, but then obviously took off really around and after World War I. And the reason for that is because if you think about the times of what I just said, the 1850s and then World War I, the increasing travel around the world is going to spread disease, and it's going to spread horrific diseases into places where people have no resistance to them at all, simply because diseases are opportunistic and they're going to move place to place. And the modern world has simply sped that up. It hasn't stopped it, it has simply sped that up. And the study of how diseases spread and what they do to populations when they spread is just fascinating. So I really don't have the time, but I'm going to tell you, those of you who don't know, one of the crucial historical contingencies of human history was that the indigenous populations who lived on North and South America did not have exposure to European and Asian diseases until the arrival of Europeans on the North and South American continents. And because they were what we call virgin soil populations, they were vulnerable to everything that the Europeans brought with them. And so many of the diseases that we have become accustomed to, or that Europeans had become accustomed to, were simply deadly, and they were getting them all at once. So in some cases, you could get influenza and measles and mumps and chickenpox and smallpox all at once. And those would hit at a time when you were, it was winter and you needed fuel, and nobody would be well enough to go get fuel, and people would die of cold before they even died of the disease, or people couldn't get water, or they couldn't get crops in the ground, so they would die from that. And that decimation of the indigenous populations, up to 90% of them were wiped out simply by disease, not only affects the settlement of North and South America, but the intrusion of European populations onto these continents under those circumstances also, of course, dramatically changed the way Europeans thought about their right to control land and the right to control new places. So, so the history of disease and the importance of disease and the transmission of disease and what that transmission of disease tells people about their roles in the world is one of the key pieces of human history. I don't really study that much, historians of disease do, but the way we think about disease and the way we think about who carries disease and who recovers from disease is absolutely instrumental to how we think about ourselves as human beings and whom we are willing to treat as neighbors versus whom we are not willing to treat as neighbors, depending on what diseases we think they carry. That's obviously the history of disease is fascinating. Anyway, so the WHO becomes instrumental after World War I and then World War II, when the transmission of disease becomes so important as different populations are moving around and getting these different diseases that they might not have otherwise. And usually when you get any kind of a large conflict, you're going to get people moving from places they hadn't been before into new places and catching new diseases. World Wars II and I, of course, but also the American Civil War, when measles sweeps through the U.S. ranks, for example, and kills all kinds of soldiers, and different diseases to which people hadn't previously been exposed, sort of ripped through the populations. So anyway, the World Health Organization is established in 1948, and it really takes this mission seriously. And think about the moment in which it's being established. This is supposed to be the American century, as Henry Luce calls it in Time magazine. This is when we're going to stop having these wars where people are fighting for who knows what, and you're going to stop having these conflicts that create the horrors that we saw in the concentration camps in Germany and in Japan, and you're going to be able to create this new world under the League of Nations that's going to eradicate ill health and eradicate poverty, and people are going to actually all have a rising standard of living. And America, especially under Truman after the war, but also under Eisenhower, really embraces this idea, because Eisenhower is so horrified by what he saw in the concentration camps in Germany. And he's like, we've got to have a rising standard for everybody, or we're going to have religious and ethnic and political wars in which dictators are going to have access to nuclear weapons, and then they're going to destroy the earth. So he's really behind this idea. And the WHO is really, really, really successful. So in 1952 to 1957, we get a polio vaccine. Again, people tend to forget nowadays that polio was deadly. Everybody knows, from my generation, knows somebody who had polio or lost somebody to polio. The polio vaccine virtually eradicates polio. It's on it's rising again, by the way, now under the coronavirus, because people can't get in to vaccinate any longer in some countries. By 1963, we have a measles vaccine. By 1969, the member states that are participating in WHO are monitoring 6 serious infections across the world. That's cholera, plague, yellow fever, smallpox, and typhus, all hideous diseases, and trying to see where they are and to hit hot spots. The idea is when you see it coming, you get it fast before it can spread. 1972, we get a global mandate on sexual and reproductive health. That's going to cause trouble when the evangelicals and social conservatives take over the Republican Party, because they don't like the WHO, because it is, for example, urging women to participate in birth control programs and counseling them on abortion. They're also talking about the use of condoms. I'll talk more about that in a minute. By 1974, the WHO is immunizing people around the globe. By 1975, it is beginning to investigate tropical diseases. And by 2016, it had virtually eliminated 5 out of the 8 original diseases it looked at. I mean, this is a great record. By 1979, they had eliminated smallpox, and smallpox was, it was not chickenpox, which is bad enough. It was like, Google images of people with smallpox. I show it in my classes, but I warn people before I show it. It's that bad. Then in 1983 to 1987, of course, we get the AIDS crisis. And the WHO begins to attract anger from social conservatives in America during the AIDS crisis, because it does not see the AIDS crisis as a moral crisis. It sees the AIDS crisis as a public health crisis. And one of the things that it urges is use of condoms. And that's something that doesn't sit well with abstinence-only people who want to say that you can stop AIDS traveling through abstinence. They don't like the idea that WHO is pushing the use of condoms. Then in 2019, after H1N1, the WHO comes up with a vaccine, and they did the same thing after the re-emergence of Ebola. In 2014, they come up with another vaccine, and by 2016, that Ebola explosion has been, or the Ebola spread has been contained. Now, here's the issue with the WHO, though. It relies on contributions for its funding, and it has a budget of about $4.2 billion now, but it depends on contributions for that. And as I say, they're designed to get, they want to have they want to attain, as they say, by all people of the highest possible level of health. They want to make everybody around the world as healthy as possible. So what happened, and why the WHO and Donald Trump have fallen apart or fallen out with each other, is that in order to do anything, the WHO has to rely on the data that it gets from member states, and it also relies on member states for its funding. So when news first, China did not want people to know it had this deadly pandemic on its hand. There's no doubt about that. and it was not forthcoming at first, but the WHO had to work with the data that it was getting from China. And it was the first to alert the world about the emergence of this dangerous illness. At the time, they didn't know it was going to be an epidemic or a pandemic, but they were the first to report on that on January 5th, 2020. At the same time, as I say, they were they were trying to work with China, so they didn't come out angrily about China. They kept saying, bring us more data, and they tried to retain a positive relationship with China, even though it was pretty clear China was withholding some of the information about this new illness. Now, at the same time, Donald Trump shut down travel. I think it was on January 31st. So he's not going to do anything until the 31st. And at the time when he shuts down travel from China, he only shuts down travel from China for the Chinese coming from China. He, of course, permits Americans to travel from China and from the infected regions of China. So that travel ban he keeps touting as his sign that he's done this amazing thing didn't really do much, not least because of the fact that it appears now that while there was stuff coming from China, there was also a version of COVID-19 coming from Europe, and of course a ban from China did nothing for that at all. But he doesn't do that until January 31st, and then if you remember, he kind of loses the month of February, and he really doesn't do much at all until March. And of course, by then, the disease is established here in the country. We don't know it yet, but it is. So while this is going on, Trump actually was very complimentary to China, if you remember. He kept saying they were doing a really good job. He was trying to negotiate a trade settlement at that time, so he didn't want to come down on China either. Similarly, he had been a big supporter of the leader of the WHO and had actually been talking to him on the phone. And the guy was floored when Trump comes out and attacks the WHO, because he's like, wait a minute, I thought we were on board here. So what happens is that by the end of March, the beginning of April, what are we in now, May? By April, when it's clear America's got a huge problem with the novel coronavirus, that we didn't jump on it when we should have, that we didn't have the testing, that the hotspots had taken off, that we had this real problem. At that point, that's when Donald Trump starts to blame the WHO and China. And that's when they Pompeo tries to call it the Wuhan virus. And they really try to fault China for this. And mind you, this is where the problem started, and they were not forthcoming. But the problem was not that. Other countries took care of that. The problem was that we didn't do anything. But rather than saying, oh crap, we screwed up, we got to jump on it now, they simply have tried to blame the WHO and to blame China. So what's happened is that on April 14th, Trump announced that the U.S. would halt its funding to the WHO, and we are were the primary supporters of the WHO, and a lot of people are as well, other countries are as well, and so are Bill and Melinda Gates, by the way. He said that we had to review the WH's role in, quote, severely mismanaging and covering up the spread of the coronavirus, unquote. And this just horrified the rest of the world, because you don't pull the funding of the world's epidemiological experts in the middle of a pandemic. Nonetheless, the WHO sort of tried to push back and said, we were the first people to mention it and to come out and declare that we had an emergency. You guys were a lot later. Nonetheless, by the middle of May, Trump said that the United States would permanently terminate all of the funding to the WHO unless the WHO made improvements in the way that they were doing whatever they were doing. Although technically, Congress is the one who who appropriates the money for the WHO. So theoretically, he shouldn't be able to do that. This is that whole congressional funding thing that we got into trouble with over Ukraine before. Trump saying he could stop the funding, even though the Office of Management and Budget says that's not legal. Just today, the WHO has announced that it will make a comprehensive evaluation of its own response to the coronavirus pandemic. And what they're clearly trying to do is to get the United States back on board. Now, the original question was, do I think that we should fund the WHO? And to me, this is an absolute no-brainer. And I mentioned earlier my fascination with the influenza, which is something totally different than the coronavirus. They're different kettles of fish altogether. But the influenza has always fascinated me because the history of influenza has been so devastating to world populations. And the influenza epidemic of 1918 was a really interesting one because until very recently, within the last 20 years, we didn't know why it was so deadly because the scientists had not been able to isolate what that particular version of the influenza was. They did finally. And as I say, I got obsessed with this. So if anybody wants to know, I could tell you the whole history. But if you've ever wondered when you get a flu shot, like how do they know what a flu shot should look like this year? That's because of the WHO. Is because they've actually got, if you will, influenza listening stations all over the world to see what the strains are that year, to see what people are getting, and to sort of say, wait a minute, this is what's happening this year. And when you look at that, and when you look at the fact that we are in a world that is so intertwined and interconnected at this point, to me it's an absolute no-brainer that we need to have some organization around the world just with its ear to the ground, trying to eliminate diseases for sure, but also trying to listen and to say, ho, we got a problem over here because of X, and therefore we need to do Y. And if it were me, I would not only reestablish the funding for the WHO, I would expand it. Because look at us now. I mean, the devastation of this novel coronavirus to the world economy is unthinkable. I mean, think of the money that would have been better spent developing an earlier basic vaccine that maybe could have been adapted at this point. So do I think it's good to fund the WHO? Absolutely. Do I fault the WHO for not speaking up to China? I understand their position. Do I think that we should be doing a better job of making sure that the world is on board for things that affect all of us? That too, 100%. So I only got to 3 questions here, and I feel bad because I wanted to finish, and I will give you just a few minutes on the question that everybody keeps asking, and maybe we can kick some of this till next week, and that is the question of how did the Republican Party go from being the party of Lincoln to being the party it is today? And with 2 minutes left, I don't really think I have a lot of time to get into that, so I'm not going to go ahead and talk about that right now. But what I will do is pick up one last question that I was hoping to tie into that, and that was a question from Nancy Mullen, who said, you know, how do we negotiate where we are right now with so many people being blind to what, with the world being as divided as it is, with people being so partisan over what seems to be a no-brainer of things like funding a World Health Organization or wearing a mask to make sure that you don't spread things that could kill other people, or even taking a look at who's in the White House and saying, no, it's not okay for you to put all the inspector generals on the chopping block because they're overseeing you. How do we get beyond that? And I think that goes back to, if you will, to what I'd hoped to talk about, the changing Republican Party. The era before the rise of the modern Republican Party, as it was taken over by movement conservatives who hate the idea of government regulation and a basic social safety net and infrastructure. Before we got these people who are so all in with the idea of unadulterated capitalism, of, you know, capitalism on steroids, before we got those, the Republican and the Democratic parties were really close together on basic ideas, on the idea that you couldn't really have unrestrained capitalism because there are always jerks who are going to take advantage of other people. So you had to have basic rules. And the same thing with the basic social safety net. No, you don't want to guarantee that people don't have to work ever in their lives. But by the same token, what do we do with our the many people who really can't support themselves for one reason or another? Do we really want, as people argued in the 1940s, to have our grandparents eating out of trash cans? I'm a big no on that one. And similarly, infrastructure. Americans are fond of talking about the fact that this is the best country on earth, but you go to most other countries, and developed countries at least, and you look at their infrastructure, their their everything, their telecommunications, their transportation systems, their energy systems. And we're stuck back in the 1970s compared to that. It's really astonishing. And I actually think that most Americans agree with that, that what is really pushing us apart are politicians who are deliberately dividing us by telling us that things like that are socialism, are communism, and that that's going to destroy the American way of life. I hope I started with such an explanation that you can see that those things are not socialism and they're not communism. What they are is regulated capitalism. And the reason that I harp on this so is because those people who are, I mean, there's a long history behind this too, but the idea that somehow we have to be all the way out with unrestrained capitalism, or somehow we're going to be living under a totalitarian government, is a really dangerous way to look at the world, because we swing the pendulum so far in one direction, the backlash is going to be extraordinary. And some people are really rooting for that backlash. I think most of us would like the pendulum to swing back somewhere to the middle from where it is right now. And I don't really have time to go into that in great detail, but how do I see that we will ever be able to overcome the minute that we're in, or the moment that we're in? Mind you, I'm not sure we will be able to. This is why I'm throwing my weight as much as I can on one side of the scale. But if we can, it's by reclaiming those basic American values of fairness. You know, it's not fair when one person gets all the benefit of the coronavirus legislation. It's not fair when tax cuts mean that all the money goes to the top of the scale. You know, it's not fair when we arrange our laws so that less than 1% of the population takes home everything. I'm in favor of fairness. And I think that a lot of maybe I'm reading this into other Americans, but I think other Americans believe the same thing, whether they have a D after their name or an R after their name, or even an I or a G, an independent or a green, that we can agree on basic American fairness. And that's what I keep trying to harp on. So that'll be it for this week. I hope that was of some use. If anybody is interested, on Thursdays at 1 o'clock, I'm doing history, and I will be wrapping up at least probably this week and maybe into next week, my trip through the last book I just wrote. And then I think I have an idea for the future if you guys are interested. But in any case, I'm always happy to do these talks. I hope you find them useful. Like I say, I enjoy them. And a disclaimer, again, my name is Heather Cox Richardson, and I'm a professor of history, but I do not speak for my employer when I do these. Anyway, thank you very much for coming along. And if you're interested, I will see you next week. I might see some of you on Thursday. And otherwise, thanks for being here.